So you just spent a bunch of money on this bigger, fancier camera, all for higher quality photos, but every time you take photos at night, you're still seeing so much grain in your shots. And I totally get it because I've been there and I personally know how difficult and intimidating night photography can be. But what if I told you it's actually not as hard as you think, and when done properly, you can capture some really amazing low light shots. So with that being said, in this video, I'm going to be covering my top 5 tips to shooting better low light photos, and we're jumping straight into it with my first tip, which is find the light source. And this is super important because remember, this video is all about shooting in low light, not no light. So you will need to have at least one source of light to help bring some contrast and dimensions to your scenes. With that being said, in most city areas, you're bound to run into some light sources that you could use to help lighten up your subject. But now, once you've found your light source, how should you properly use it? And well, there are many different ways you can position your subjects with these lights, but one of my favorites is backlighting. And basically, this is when you're going to place your subjects in front of your light source to help create a silhouette in your shots. So as you can see in these examples, my light sources are behind my subjects, which are then causing this silhouette and creating contrast in my photos. Backlighting your subjects like this is great when doing things like street photography at night because you'll be able to use a higher shutter speed, which will then ensure you are capturing sharp photos. If you're shooting portraits in low light, then another way to position these light sources is either a front or side light, and to do this, all you need to do is place your model in a position where the light is exposing their face. So for example, in this photo, I placed my model to the side of this lantern and I got her to face the light source, but then asked her to look at the camera. For this shot, I used a TV screen that was playing outside of a store to help expose my model, and I asked her to face the light source to ensure her face would be exposed evenly. So just remember, you need to find at least one source of light, and then you can use that to position your subject in various ways. But now moving on to tip number 2, and that is drag your shutter speed. And I'm not going to go too in depth about shutter speed in this video because I do have a dedicated video for that, which I have linked below. But basically, dragging your shutter is when you set a low shutter speed to allow more light to come into your camera's sensor. But you do need to be careful when using a low shutter speed for moving subjects, because when you use a slow shutter speed like 5 seconds, the camera is taking 5 seconds to actually take the photo, and it will capture all the movement that occurs during that 5 seconds. So with that being said, how I personally like to use low shutter speeds in low light photography is firstly panning shots. So panning shots is when you're going to track a moving subject with your camera, and you're going to set your camera to burst mode and take photos as your subject moves throughout the frame. And the goal with panning photography is to capture a still photo of your subject while the background is all blurred like this to help showcase movement. And for these panning shots, I usually set my shutter speed to around 1/13, but depending on how fast your subject is moving, you will want to play around with this. Another situation I like using low shutter speeds is when I want to capture light trails. And basically, this is when you're going to set your camera on a tripod and then set a very slow shutter speed, and you're going to capture the motion of the cars. So for example, for this shot, I took this from a bridge that went over a freeway, and as we can see here, my camera captured all the movement from the cars below. This is the same technique I used for this photo, but instead of capturing the motion of cars, I captured the motion of people moving behind me. Also, a pro tip when using these really slow shutter speeds with a tripod is to use the self-timer feature inside of your camera to actually take the photo. Because when you manually press the shutter button with these lower shutter speeds, you can actually cause unwanted blur to appear in your photos. But now moving on to my next tip for low light photography, and that is lower apertures. Now again, I'm not going to go too into depth about aperture in this video because I do have a dedicated video for that, but just remember, the lower the f-stop on your lens, the wider the iris will open, which will then mean more light will hit your camera's sensor, therefore brightening up your whole scene. So if possible, I'd recommend using lenses that have an aperture of f2.8 or below for any low light situations, because not only will you get access to more light, but you'll be able to capture more background blur in your shots. And in night photography, you can get really creative with this background blur. And typically, prime lenses offer lower apertures and are cheaper than zoom lenses. So if you are in the market to pick up a new lens, then I would recommend some of the Sigma Art lenses because they are high quality, they work for most camera bodies, and they go down to f1.4, and they are typically cheaper than other manufacturers. With that being said though, if you can't afford a lens with an aperture of f2.8 or below, then just make sure to use the lowest aperture your lens offers, and then mix that with a slow shutter speed to ensure you are bringing in as much light into your camera as possible. But now moving on to my next tip for better low light photography, and that is know your ISO. And for those of you that don't know what ISO is, it's basically a setting inside of your camera that allows you to digitally brighten up your images, but when pushed too far, you'll start to lose quality in your shots and you'll start to see digital noise get added to your photos. And different cameras will perform better or worse with these higher ISO numbers. So for example, if you're shooting with a full frame camera or a crop sensor, or even if you're shooting with a Fuji over a Canon. With that being said, my general recommendation is that if you're shooting with a full frame camera, then your max ISO should be around 6400, and if you're shooting with a crop sensor camera, then shoot under ISO 1600. And again, depending on your camera, you'll probably still see some noise at these ISO levels, but it shouldn't look too bad, and if you're just posting these photos onto social media, then people won't even notice. Personally for me, a big reason I use Sony cameras is that they are the best when it comes to shooting with these higher ISO numbers. So if you are planning on shooting a lot of low light content, then investing into a full frame Sony camera could be a great option for you. So now the previous 4 tips, we focus on what we can do while out in the field, but something to keep in mind is that we can still improve the quality of our photos even after we've taken the shot. So that brings me to my final tip, and that is editing. So generally in softwares like Lightroom, there are tools we can use to help reduce the amount of noise in our photos. So let's quickly jump into Lightroom and I'll show you how we can use them. Alright, so I'll be using Lightroom Classic for this tutorial, but all the tools that I'll be using can be used in any version of Lightroom. Also, this photo was taken from pexels.com and was shot by Rodrigo Santos, and I have left a link to the photo for you to download as well if you do want to follow along. But let's just jump straight into it by first zooming into this photo, and then we can see that there is some grain on the model's face. So to fix this, I'm going to first open up the basic panel and then brighten up this photo by bringing up the exposure like so. Next, I'm going to bring down the texture to about -10, and then from here I'm going to open up the detail tab, and when editing low light photos, this noise reduction area is going to be your best friend. So for this photo, I'm going to raise this luminance slider to about +35, and what this is doing is smoothing out the photo, but you do have to be careful when raising up this slider because the more you raise it, the less detail you're going to have in your shots. So with that being said, I'm going to raise the sharpening to about +25, and then I'm going to raise this masking slider up to about +90. From here, I'm going to go back into the basic tab and raise the whites and contrast to help bring back some overall contrast to the shot. And now if we take a look at the before and after, we can see a big difference in the overall grain of this shot. We can see the photo on the right, the model's face looks a lot smoother. Now a pro tip that will help you when you're editing is shooting your photos in RAW. So be sure to turn this on before you actually start shooting, because RAW files contain a lot more information, which will then help you to clean up your low light photos even more when you're editing. But there we have it. That is my top 5 tips for better low light photography. And if you're interested in learning more stuff like this, I'm currently running a free photography training where I break down my top tips to capturing professional looking photos without the use of any expensive camera gear. Inside of this free training, I'll also be covering the key steps I took to turning my passion of photography into a full-time career. You can hit the link in the description below to check that out if you're interested. And also, I'll be posting a bunch of new videos to this channel, so if you want to stay up to date with all the new content coming, hit the like and subscribe button on your way out, and I'll see you in the next one.